Good afternoon. My name is Joshua Katz. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, Literature in Limbo, the State of English as an Academic Discipline. This is the second event in a series at AEI on the academic disciplines, a series inaugurated in April with a likewise alliterative and, if I may say so, thoroughly engaging panel on sociology titled A Discipline in Disarray. The aims of this series are two. First, to move the conversation away from the people who dominate the headlines, namely student protesters, anxious administrators, and bureaucrats in Washington, and instead concentrate on what should be the beating heart of any educational institution, the faculty, in departments from anthropology to zoology and from the business school to the School of Public Health, most of whom do simply wish to get on with the teaching and research that they consider important. And the second aim of the series is to help fix the situation the AEI way, which is to say by building and rebuilding institutions rather than simply criticizing and calling for them to be burned down. If literature is, in fact, in limbo, and I should say that I will be very happy if some of today's panelists take issue with the idea that it is, if literature is in limbo, how do we bring it to heaven? The problems with English are not new. Those of you of a certain age almost surely encountered heated rhetoric already decades ago in the national media's presentation of skirmishes between traditionalists and progressives, which have been going on at least since the 1960s and were particularly fervent in the 1980s and early 1990s. But a couple of recent high-profile essays point to some of the problems that departments of English are encountering today. A year ago, Rose Horowitz, who has been writing hard-hitting articles about higher education for The Atlantic, noted that professors have, in the last few years, discovered that they can no longer assign novels, since, to quote the chair of the English department at Georgetown, students have trouble staying focused on even a sonnet. This helps explain why, at Princeton, the extremely difficult comprehensive exams that second semester seniors took 2 decades ago, as a young faculty member there, I used to read through them with admiration. This explains why they were replaced in 2021 by, and I quote, an 800-word reflection statement that details your intellectual development. And in 2025, of course, such a reflection might well be written by AI. Horowitz's piece followed on the heels of a viral article in The New Yorker by Nathan Heller titled The End of the English Major, which noted that between 2013 and 2023, the study of English at the collegiate level fell by a full third. Keep in mind that almost 40 years earlier, William J. Bennett, then the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and soon to become Secretary of Education, published to distressed fanfare To Reclaim a Legacy, a report on the humanities in higher education, which pointed out that the number of majors in English had declined by 57% from 1970 to 1984. And between Bennett's governmental report and Heller's popular article, we find such accounts on what has happened to the discipline as the late Brown University professor Robert Scholz's The Rise and Fall of English, which came out in 1998. So there is a lot to talk about. And we have an all-star cast to help us out with 3 quite different panelists, Amanda Anderson, Michael Clune, and Daniel Gibbons, plus, as moderator, Chris Scalia, once a professor of English himself, and now my sparkling colleague at AEI, under whose auspices he published in May a terrific book titled 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read. English professors of this caliber speak eloquently for themselves, so I will be brief in introducing our guests. First up, alphabetically, is Amanda Anderson, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English and Humanities and Director of the Kogut Institute for the Humanities at Brown. A prolific scholar of 19th and 20th century English literature with 9 books to her name and many articles, Professor Anderson is also deeply invested in the matter of defining the humanities in the 21st century, and particularly in determining the disciplinary status of English. Her co-edited 2002 volume, Disciplinary at the Fin de Siècle, is one of the reasons we invited her to join today's discussion. And her next book, Humanities Theory, co-authored with Simon During, is scheduled to be published 3 months from now, at least in the United States, by Oxford University Press. Next in alphabetical order is Michael Clune, who has just moved to the new Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at The Ohio State University after many years at Case Western, where he held a named chair in the humanities in the Department of English. A scholar, memoirist, and now author of a widely acclaimed novel, Pan, Chase is a heterodox thinker whose best-known scholarly work, A Defense of Judgment, published in 2021, presents a bracing account of aesthetics and defends aesthetic judgment against dogmatic equality, the conceit that no one's taste counts for more than anyone else's. Besides writing books, he is a contributing editor to Harper's Magazine and has written for The Atlantic, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and, speaking of high taste, the Paris Review. And last but not least, if I may linger longer on literature and Limbo's alliteration, Daniel Gibbons, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in English at the Catholic University of America. An expert on Elizabethan and Jacobean poetry and drama, Professor Gibbons is best known for his 2017 book, Conflicts of Devotion, Liturgical Poetics in 16th and 17th Century England. He thinks a lot about the rhetoric of the Book of Common Prayer and about the relationship generally between literature and religion, and he is currently working on a book about Shakespeare's struggle with Augustinian theology. He has written learned articles for such journals as Studies in Philology, Studies in English Literature, and Texas Studies in Literature and Language, and he spends a great deal of time orienting the studies of Catholics English majors, and of special importance, I think, advising potential majors. But that's enough for me. It gives me great pleasure to hand things over now to Chris to get us going on what I am sure will be a lively and productive conversation. Chris.
Thank you very much, Joshua. That's a really helpful introduction, and I'm very excited about this conversation. Thank all of you for making it out here for this talk, and all of you, too, for attending, of course. I'm going to pepper our panelists with gotcha questions for the next hour or so before turning it over to all of you for Q&A. So be sure to take copious notes as we go along so you can refer to them during your questions. I want to start by really handing it over to all of you, to each of you, for basically some opening remarks, about 5 minutes of your thoughts about this very broad topic, about the state of literature as a discipline. And then once we hear from all of you, I'll follow up with specific questions about things that you may have touched on or just hinted at obliquely. And Amanda, let's start with you.
Okay. I'm going to speak up at the podium if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So Chris provided us with a range of really interesting topics ahead of time and asked us to choose what we would like to focus our opening remarks on. So I'm going to begin with one of the questions that he posed, which is the question of whether the discipline of English literature has become too politicized and dominated by theory, where too theoretical means too abstruse, operating in a specialized language that's inaccessible to a general public, and that applies a similar framework to all that it analyzes. In this sense, the two charges are interrelated, since politicized criticism is seen as driven also by a pre-given agenda. The current administration has heightened the situation by charging that the entire university has become too woke. But I will stick with English, since laudably, the AEI is focusing on particular disciplines so as to promote informed discussion about specific research areas of the university. So first, let's unpack a bit what too politicized or theoretical implies. Too politicized implies that the field is invested in pushing or enforcing a particular ideological viewpoint. The current administration calls it radical left ideology. Too theoretical has its own connotations and assumptions. The idea that literary studies has strayed from an original form of criticism, one dedicated, let's say, to the object itself, with certain methodological tools, but no preconceived framework through which to analyze the text and its formal qualities. The charge is that by using theory, literary scholars are reading everything through a certain lens. For example, a psychoanalytic lens, or a Marxist lens, or a deconstructive lens. So the two charges carry a sense that the field has strayed from a presumed more modest, non-political, neutral, empirical, or objective form of criticism. There are certainly forms of scholarship for which these charges are understandable. But before we talk about that, something more fundamental needs to be lit up. And that has to do with the way in which questions of value, in the broadest sense, are at the heart of humanities practice. Questions about what matters, how we wish to live, individually and collectively, how we make meaning, or what we consider to be meaningful, how we understand human experience, and how these questions have been posed and answered across history and across cultures. They are not the only type of question or knowledge at play. There are questions of language, form, and style, of aesthetic merit, and questions of literary history, which is to say the development of different forms over time. But the larger question of value, as I have described it, cannot be avoided, and this is relevant to the question of politicization. Whether you're talking about the realist novel, or lyric poetry, or tragic drama, literature is about the experience of the human, and the study of literature is both about the formal and aesthetic qualities of literary texts and the thematic ones, which inevitably involve questions of value. Thus, one might see within a literary work a powerful treatment of human virtues or forms of heroism, or human failings, as in a tragedy. One might see powerful critiques of social inequality, as in certain realist novels, such as Zola or Dickens. One might see ways in which humans respond to violence or entrenched divisions, as in Anna Burns's 2018 novel Milkman, which treats the troubles in Ireland and the powerful tendency toward normalization of oppressive conditions. Or one might see brilliant representations of the inner life in its struggles with time and mortality, as in Virginia Woolf, or to take a more recent example, Marilynne Robinson's 2004 novel, Gilead. The question then becomes, what would it mean to be too political or to politicize? My own view is that pedagogically, what the study of literature presents is the opportunity to engage not in the imposition of worldviews, but in the clarification of value through careful interpretive argument and open debate. The starting premise is that there will be value pluralism in any group of individuals discussing a particular work, and that any complex work of literature will not yield to a simple interpretive result. The goal is to teach students to provide convincing arguments for the values they attribute to, and potentially at another level critique with respect to any given text. So for example, one might argue that Dickens shows wealth disparity in Victorian England quite effectively, but also sentimentalizes the poor. Or as Orwell charged, Dickens provides individual virtue as a solution to systemic problems that he otherwise searingly exposes as systemic. Is that politicizing? Or is that analysis and critique? Individual scholars will have their own value systems, and that will inform what they write and positions they might express in class, ideally forthrightly and transparently. But I believe the classroom must remain a place of value pluralism. Teaching various theories, Marxism, psychoanalysis, virtue ethics, liberalism, communitarianism, can help students to work through their own value commitments while also aiming for a clear and good faith understanding of what various authors believe and how their formal achievements help to convey that. It helps the field of literature have greater philosophical, sociological, and psychological depth. There is nothing wrong with that, in my view. I have my own agreements and disagreements about various frameworks of analysis, some of which I think impose too heavily and uniformly an interpretive view. I am especially critical of strong historical teleological concepts as super-explanatory, whichever side of the political spectrum they fall on. For example, imperialism or racial capitalism on the left, the end of history, or the triumph of Western values on the right. I'm also critical of frameworks that don't think through moral and psychological issues, the broader question of the human as a moral and political being never fully determined by their sociological position, or in the parlance of the day, by their identity or identities. That said, my view is that scholars will inevitably choose topics and generate arguments that align with their own value commitments. There's nothing wrong with that, and academic freedom should fully protect that. Where I think it matters most to be open and pluralistic is in the classroom, and when speaking for larger research areas or organizations, a discipline, a department, or the university more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. We'll just go down the row here. So, Daniel?
All right, I'll be a little less formal and probably less illuminating. I want to really express my gratitude for being invited to be up here today with these really eminent scholars and to speak with you about something that I love. The reason I do this work is because I love it. And the reason students come and want to study it is because they love it too. At least that's my view, and I think that drives the work that we do at my institution, the Catholic University of America. And I think maybe, while I can't contribute as much depth of history and knowledge as my colleagues, what I can present is a distinctive perspective coming from a religious institution. And the question of what the place of literary study is and should be in a religious institution, I think is an important one to reflect on. So the study of literature, as we understand it at the Catholic University of America, should be primarily focused on aesthetics, the study of beauty, and literary history, the way that different manifestations of verbal beauty have worked their way out through history and intersected with human events. And that in itself, I think, is a really promising area for the future. It doesn't constrain political views. It doesn't constrain religious views. But what it does is identify a disciplinary area that's proper to a field of study. And one thing that a lot of times is identified as a problem with literary study in the universities nowadays is that it's hard to tell what it even is. What are we even doing? And I think in my role as the director of undergraduate studies, I interact a lot with students and families who are trying to figure out which college their child's going to go to and what they're going to study at that college. And that's a live question, right? If I'm going to send my child off for 4 years and invest a lot of time and resources into that, what's my child going to be doing? And so the question of scholarship and what the future of literary scholarship looks like, to a certain extent, practically anyway, depends a lot on that question of love. And that's simply a matter of what sort of institutional place we will be allowed to have going forward. Part of the problem that I think a lot of English departments face is simply that we aren't telling the story of what we do and why we do it and why young people should invest their lives in it for 4 years at least well enough. And I think it's a shame, because we're the people who are supposed to know about stories and how stories work. And if we're being overwhelmed by a cultural narrative that says the study of literature is a waste of time, the study of literature isn't really useful to anybody, the study of literature is a form of political indoctrination that I don't really want to pay for, we've got a problem. And we need to change the story, right? If we really understand how stories work, it's on us to try to find ways to project that story of the nature, the value, and the lovableness of the study of literature. And if young people want to come to our institutions and study literature, there will be a place in those institutions for it. It's really hard to maintain a place in the institution if you don't have people who love it. And a lot of that love has to come from the ground up. It has to come from our students. And I think that the topic of love is pretty important, because in a Christian institution, a Catholic institution like my own, we talk a lot about the relationship between faith and reason. But in the Catholic intellectual tradition, ultimately, everything is judged by love. We believe in a God who is love. And in the end, if what we're doing in college isn't making us better lovers, then we really are wasting our time. In fact, we might be harming ourselves. So I think to reflect a little bit on love and the role of literary studies in the formation of our capacity to love is perhaps the most important thing that we can do if we are in a moment of crisis. And I think it relates a little to the topic of our session, because if Dante's right, there's no getting out of limbo. If we are in limbo, we will have perfect, eternal flatline, right? A loveless existence in a kind of an ivory tower. There's a literal tower in Dante's Limbo, with intellectuals talking to each other endlessly and pleasantly, but with no fire of love that could raise us up to a higher level. And so I hope we're not in limbo. I mean, it's undeniable that a lot of English programs are losing enrollments, are not inspiring students to come and study. And I think we do need to reflect a lot on that. But I hope where we are is purgatory and not limbo. Because purgatory, there is hope for change. And it's by a process of learning how to be a better lover. And sometimes that takes suffering, and it takes a lot of self-reflection in Dante's vision. And so what can we do in order to make ourselves better lovers of our students, better lovers of our craft, the craft of teaching, the craft of scholarship? And how can we help other people to see what's lovable about us? How can we help young people to see that? And how can we help folks who control some resources in our society and want to build a better society with those resources? I think we have to share the human quality of what we do. We have to be able to articulate the nature of our discipline. We have to articulate why it should matter to young people. The difficulty, I think, a lot of times is that there's a lot of confusion about what a university education even is. And so to talk about a major within the university is difficult, because if the university doesn't know what it's for, how can the majors know what they're for? But at the very least, I think in my program, with my colleagues whom I respect and admire greatly, we have a clear sense that we can find truth through beauty. And it's not that there's some single final answer that our students are going to reach, but that you can grow in wisdom. And through literature, that growth in wisdom can create souls that love better. And if our teaching is oriented toward that, I think there's hope to climb the mountain. And I think if we can communicate well to folks who want to invest in the future of this country, how much we need to help young people become better lovers of each other, better lovers of truth, better lovers of our country. We need literature, and we need strong programs in literature at our universities. And we need a variety of different disciplinary approaches. But we need to invest in that. And we, scholars and teachers, need to turn our attention always to investing in our students and to the human growth of the young people with whom we're working, and helping them to love better, and helping them, we hope, to come closer to heaven.
Thank you, Daniel. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to be with two wonderful colleagues. This is about English as a discipline. A little bit, just a very brief reflection on what that has meant in the post-World War II era. It wasn't at all obvious to people during the period of the great expansion of the what we now know as the modern research university. It wasn't obvious to people that English should be a discipline within that enterprise. The way that it got in was through a very successful educational program that went under the aegis of the New Criticism. And there are two salient features of that era, that founding, modern disciplinary founding of English. One was we had a object of study, which was great literature. Second, we had a method, which is close reading. The careful attention to great literature with the idea that certain works, not all works, not most works, certain works repay that kind of close attention and disclose insights and experiences that are not available elsewhere. Okay, so that sort of was the model that very successfully resulted in the establishment of English departments in the GI Bill era of the explosion of university enrollment in the U.S. Fast forward to 1998 when I entered graduate school, and my advisor told me, we do analysis here, we don't do appreciation, right? That's how he described what the discipline was. And that right there, I think, encapsulates a lot of where we are today, which is in those intervening decades, what happened was the tacit assumption and sense that the materials we work with are great literature. And that's why we're looking at them. That's why students would take our classes, because we're going to show them how to understand. We're going to open these often forbidding and difficult works to our students. That's what we're doing. In those intervening decades, those two got prized apart. Now we're doing analysis and close reading, but we're no longer committed to the idea that these works are great works of literature. Okay? To me, that was a catastrophe, and it destroyed the very coherence of the discipline of English. To the point now, I was talking with a friend in a well-regarded English department today, and she observed that she was at a conference, and they had the question of what is English, and no one knew what it was. No one could answer, right? Everyone had a different answer. It fundamentally lacks a coherence. What displaced professors' confidence that these works are great, that you should read Shakespeare or Gwendolyn Brooks or Dante, that these are great enduring works that can disclose new ideas and insights and perceptions to generations of students? What replaced aesthetic or literary judgment, in my view, was political judgment. The idea that what we're doing is we're viewing texts as exemplary of certain good or salutary political attitudes, or certain negative political attitudes. The other dimension, the other sort of strain, was that professors began to use texts not as valuable in themselves, but as illustrations, and Amanda referred to this, as illustrations or examples of some theory that professors took from somewhere else, from some other discipline. The problem with all of these approaches is that when you ask the question, what is an English professor qualified to do? What does my training as an English professor authorize me to say to a class of students? Why should you pay me money, in short, to tell you what I think? The answer is, I have a good, if I'm making literary judgments, I can tell you reasons why you should grant my authority for literary judgment in certain contexts, in classroom contexts and so forth. But nothing in my training qualifies me to be a judge of political matters. And when it comes to the theories to which Amanda alluded, very often what one finds is English professors making claims about economics that can't be taken seriously in economics, in the discipline of economics, or psychology, and psychologists don't understand what the hell they're talking about. And so there's a real question about what exactly is the expertise that English professors have. I'll end just by gesturing at a development, and this was something that Chris asked us to think about, which I think is hopeful for the discipline of English and for the discipline of literary studies, and that's the advent of AI. And the reason I say it's hopeful is because I wrote the judgment book to which you graciously referred 4 years ago. 5 years ago I wrote it. It was published 4 years ago. And you know, there was a lot of people said, we can't, it's elitist to judge great literature. Who's to say that Shakespeare's greater than, you know, whatever you find at your bookstore or whatever? There's a lot of hand-wringing, and that was the response I expected. That response has really changed dramatically over the past year as we've been confronted with the specter of AI. AI forces us as English professors to confront the question of judgment as an existential kind of choice. In other words, we need to tell students the reason why an AI summary of a work of literature is valueless, in that the work of literature, the very work it does, is a work and an operation upon a human being, a human person, right? We also need to be able to say why human writers can create objects and artifacts of enduring value in ways that large language models, I'm not talking about general AI, which is a figure of hope, something that doesn't yet exist, but why large language models cannot create works that have those same qualities. And further, why the fact that a work of literature is written by a human person endows it with an intentionality and a depth which gives it value. So judgment and the embrace of literary value and the capacity to tell students certain works really are wonderful, will change your life, are transformative, are enduring. That's really, to me, it's always been at the center of English. It's fallen away from the center of the actual discipline. But my hope is, and actually what I've begun to see just in the past year as I've given talks in various places and heard responses to my work, I feel that there's been a sea change and that people in literature are again willing to embrace judgment, and the judgment of great literature is the very foundation of the enterprise of English. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you all for that wonderful range of insights to open things up. Michael just was talking about AI. So there are also so many threads I want to pick up on, but because AI was just most recently on the table, let's start there. Amanda, I wonder if you have some thoughts about AI and how I'm particularly interested in, and of course, Daniel, I want to hear yours too. How how you've had to change your ways of teaching and assigning works, what you assign, and especially writing assignments, how you've had to change that over the past couple of years in the face of artificial intelligence or artificial ignorance in some cases. And Daniel, the same question to you. And then Michael, while I'm at it, Ohio State has an AI fluency initiative. According to the website, it will ensure that every Ohio State student beginning with the class of 2029 will graduate being AI fluent in their field of study, and fluent in the application of artificial intelligence in that field. So we'll close up this line of questioning with your response to what your new university is up to there.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and it's wonderful to hear everybody's remarks. I completely agree with Michael about the question of judgment, but I think of judgment as not just aesthetic judgment, but moral judgment. And judgment is one thing that AI, at least so far, fails to capture. And that's really, really crucial. It fails to capture layered experience. It fails to capture intuition. It fails to capture spiritual experience. And these are all things that are, crucially important. In terms of your specific question, Chris, there's sort of two lines of thought right now at the universities, and it's certainly true at Brown, which is on the one hand to devise workarounds which involve having people do in-class writing. I was just advising an early career scholar the other day who said that the students who were doing posts on the electronic blackboard, that they all sounded like AI. And so I said, well, just switch it and make them write the post. How long is your class? 80 minutes, great, okay. Have them write the post at the beginning of the class and don't give the prompt until they get in there. Tell them what they're supposed to read. So that's one thing people are doing. Another thing they're doing is just trying to develop transparent ways to make agreements, really, about using AI transparently. So kind of like using it maybe to address a couple of preliminary questions that will help build a research project, but then actually reflect upon how you're going to go beyond that and what you'll be doing, in order to make, let's just say, the research paper your own. So those are sort of the two lines of approach that I'm seeing right now. Just one other thing I think is crucial, and this sort of goes back to the question of students not being able to read works of any length. Historically, I'm a Victorian scholar, so let's just forget it. But we'll spend 2 years reading Middlemarch. I actually think that we might need to have labs in the humanities where you come and you read together, whether silently or out loud, and then either discuss or write. And in fact, we have an AI lab, AI in the Humanities lab at the institute that I direct, and the wonderful modern European historian who is running it with a computer scientist, this is an interdivisional lab, generated a lot of reading groups, invited people to create reading groups, and one of the groups just sort of organically decided to do that they would meet and read together and then discuss. And part of it was because nobody had any time, but also this question of concentration. So I do think that we're going to have to be very resourceful and creative and persistent at sort of protecting deep study, slow study, against this sort of flat and fast AI.
Mm-hmm. Daniel?
Yeah, thanks. I should say, on the one hand, I think I'm really fortunate. We have a small major, but mighty, I would say. And the students who come to us, although we don't have a gigantic major that dominates the university, the students who come to us, they want to read. They come to us because they love books and they want to read. They're not coming to us as a stepping stone to some particular profession. And so in that way, we still assign long books, and our students read them and we talk about them. And I hope that's true for a lot of my colleagues too, but I know it's really fortunate when I read, stories from others in the profession. So, and we still give a comprehensive exam to our seniors, and they are mostly able to pass it. And, so I mean, in that way, I'm just very optimistic that while there may be a kind of reduced footprint, the remnant are strong. And if universities can continue to see the value of what we're doing, I think we will still continue to attract young people who love reading and love writing. But as for AI specifically, it's true. Everybody's talking about AI, and Catholic U has its own initiatives trying to explore the potential of AI. In the English department, I think the most important thing to remember is that when you're teaching writing and trying to create a culture of writing and help students to love writing, you really do, if you want to do that well, we've always known that you really have to invest a lot of yourself as a teacher in the process and create a process-driven pedagogy for the teaching of writing. Yeah, I mean, it's always been easy to cheat if you just throw out a 5-page essay at the end of a semester and say, write it. I mean, you can always buy that from somebody if you want it. That hasn't changed because we have robots to do it now. But if you want to really invest in your students and you really you love them and you want to help them become more loving humans and to really invest themselves in the work, well, then you got to break it down, right? And you break it down into a lot of small parts, and you're there and you're responsive, and you help them build a culture of writing together, and come to hold each other accountable, come to invest in themselves as writers and think of themselves as writers. And the more we can do that, the better off we're going to be, and the more invulnerable we will be, I suppose, to AI. It's hard to do that on a large scale. Universities really will need to invest in that if they care about it. But I think just doing better, the thing that we've known for some time is actually the best way to teach writing, is the best way for us to just keep teaching it. We need to recommit ourselves to that, and recommitting ourselves to being there in the process with our students every step of the way.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and great reflections. First, I'd say about the reading thing. When that article came out, I was just like, this is not my experience. You know what I mean? It just isn't. And I'm not doubting that lots of folks have had the experience that students refuse to read or are not reading, and I think there's some variance based on type of institution about that. But one thing that's remarkable is reading is really alive. Like, people read a lot. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously the related to the pandemic, publishing's numbers went way up. Book clubs, young people I meet, older people I meet outside of academia or I hear from, people are interested in reading and motivated to read. Whether that's happening in English classes in particular is a different kind of question. And to my mind, and this relates to something that Daniel said, part of it involves motivating students to read. Right? Why is this important? You know what I mean? Why is this valuable? And again, one of the things that's been frustrating to me about being in a discipline that for decades kind of lost the capacity to make the argument that literature is great and you should read is that they completely had no answer to that question. Why should I take an English class? Why should I read this book that you've assigned? Switching to the OSU's AI fluency initiative, I'll say that in general, I'm an AI skeptic in a few different senses. I'm skeptical that the current LLM models will actually be able to do the things that people imagine they'll be able to do in 3 to 5 years or 10 years or whatever. That's a different topic. I do think the tools are probably here to stay, and that fluency really involves shining a light on those human capacities that AI cannot replicate. Right? The fear is that we're going to graduate a generation of college students who've used AI to get through college and basically have graduated without thinking or writing, right? And then they're launched into a job market in which most entry-level positions are being automated, or there's a sense that a lot of them will be automated, and the demand is precisely for those kinds of skills, creative thinking, and so forth, that their education has not endowed them with, right? So that, I think, is the worry. So how, and I think to the credit of OSU's provost, how each discipline approaches this question of AI fluency is different. What I intend to do, I think is a useful exercise, is ask ChatGPT to summarize a page of great literature. Right, and then you can show the students, like, here's the summary, and then compare that with the actual page and ask what's been missed, right? What kinds of qualities of language or qualities of thought or nuances of thought are not there, right? And so I think there's a capacity to learn what these models can do well, and there's lots of things they can do well, but what they can't do well. And then endow students with the capacity to make that distinction, and then motivate the development of capacities that really are something that is impossible, at least right now, to replicate. And in my view, there's real constraints in how, Amanda mentioned judgment as one of the many things they can't do.
Right. Amanda?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one sort of clarification. So first of all, I'm very fortunate to be at a university, Brown, that has extremely committed humanities. They're called concentrators, but majors. And I would say that my experience is probably closer to the one that you're describing. But when I was talking about the general problem, I'm trying to avoid, exceptionalism of my institution, which actually has had healthy English major numbers, and they have even increased over the last 10 years at about a 5% compounding rate. And some of that is because we have an open curriculum. We don't have distribution requirements, so tons of people double major. And the other thing is that nonfiction writing is part of English, and there's a nonfiction writing track, so it's not in creative writing, or as it's called there, literary arts. I think those contribute to it. But the students that I have the privilege to work with, along with your experience, that they love to read. They think it's worth reading works for many reasons, not just because they're aesthetically great. But the thing about reading labs that I said, it's the phone addiction. It's the inability to read in a sustained way that probably afflicts the most of the people in the room. It's no longer generational. So that's a case where you really have to start thinking about how can you build spaces where there is time, that are protected spaces of concentration. All my classes are no screen. That's a start. School systems are starting to do that. But it's a really big problem, and it's beyond simply sort of loving literature. It's about, this really profound screen addiction.
And I'll say there's an easy solution. I have a flip phone.
I can't do it.
Yeah, well.
I think when we talk about AI, it's easy to see how English majors would recognize the shortcomings and the problems with resorting to AI for plot summaries or a writing assignment. My concern would be more with the non-majors, students in survey courses, as well as for the professors in those courses, who are, I think, from what I understand, often resorting to grading with AI even. But it's certainly a start that at least the majors seem to get it. Joshua mentioned that Atlantic story about how terrible the state of reading is. There was something floating around the internet. I don't know. This study was only published last year, but the report was published last year in the CEA Critic, but the study itself was conducted in 2015. And these scholars asked 85 English majors to read 7 paragraphs of Bleak House, a nice short Victorian novel, and then basically rewrite or interpret the paragraphs in their own words. and the findings were indeed bleak. 58%, I'll just read out two of the findings from this report. 58% understood so little of the introduction to Bleak House that they would not be able to read the novel on their own. But, at least that's what the scholars believed, but the students themselves were pretty confident they could understand the entire novel on their own. Only 5%, 4 of the 85, had a detailed literal understanding of the first paragraphs of Bleak House. And these are English majors. And this was in 2015. So cell phones were on the rise, but certainly I would assume things have gotten a little bit worse. But I bring that up to make everybody panic a little bit. But it is good to know that from what I understand, your experiences have been a little different. I get the sense, Daniel, when you were describing in your answer the pitch you would make, or you were arguing that we've kind of forgot how to tell the story of the English major, and for you, it's a love story. It is the story about, to your students, you would make the pitch about great works of art generally and great works of literature specifically make us more capable of loving God, loving each other, loving the world around us. Amanda, your focus was on value and literature as kind of an area where we consider different values, the values we hold, the values the artists hold, the writers hold or cherish. Is that how you pitch the humanities in general? Because I know this is something you do quite a bit of. Is that the argument you would make for why people should study the humanities generally and English in particular? Or what is the story you would tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would tell, I think I would include that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I do have a TEDx talk that if anybody's interested, you know, does sort of walk through that in a kind of accessible way to get to that point about we don't directly impart value. We teach the clarification of value, but my answer is secular, clearly, in contrast to Daniel's. I think I would talk about, you know, all of the amazing skills and forms of knowledge and forms of understanding. I mean, the sort of the short version of, you know, my pitch is it helps you to lead the exam into life.
Yeah.
You know, but I would talk about the ways in which you know, I'm a novel person, so you know, I would talk about the ways in which literature helps to teach you forms of psychological insight, sociological insight, historical insight. See, I'm a little less, you know, stay in your lane, Michael, because I feel like most, you know, serious intellectuals become, you know, maybe not ideally polymathic, but they tend to like, if you're studying a period of English literature, you want to know the history, you want to know the philosophers that wrote during that time. You might get really interested in, I'm fascinated by psychology, and I'm partly fascinated by it because I take issue with the fact that psychoanalysis was so dominant in literary studies, and I'm much more interested in British object relations. And I don't feel like I'm, you know, a pretender. I've read tons of it. So I think the idea that, you know, we can only say this is great literature, but part of the way you're saying it's great is you're saying the kinds of insights it's presenting, and you have to have a wide humanist, you know, kind of, which you have.
Yeah,
you know,
let me
in
just
order,
say, Amanda,
in order to convey that. I mean, you know, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I would talk about close reading. I think close reading is one of the most amazing things that you can develop as an English major. And it's thrilling, you know, to sort of sit with a page and hear people talk about the various things they're reading into it and the, you know, the nuances of different words. Communication in general, which is, you know, if you want to sort of be strategic, these are going to be skills that are going to be in great demand with the rise of AI. Being able to communicate in really flexible, meaningful ways. You know, Robert Reich has recently, the Secretary of Labor under Clinton, has recently written a blog that said, in AI, that says that there's 3 kinds of jobs: making, thinking, and caring. And making is already, because of like the Industrial Revolution, whatever, and factories, it's already automated. Thinking is getting largely automated through AI, but kind of low-level thinking, but still, accountants. I mean, I don't mean to disparage any profession or say that they're not using judgment too, but like just certain levels of activity within what were seen to be protected professions. But caring, and he adduces elder care and child care, but also, one has to say teaching, what they call the high touch, activities, they're going to be crucial. And being an English major is going to give you all sorts of forms of understanding, skills. People often talk about empathy as something that gets, promoted. But so, I mean, I realize that's a lot. I'm kind of throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall. But those are the kinds of things that I would stress if I were talking to a student. And I would also say, in total sympathy with Daniel, if you love it, major in it.
Yeah.
There's no great harm is going to come from it. The computer science majors can't get jobs. Who knows what'll happen?
The argument you were just making is, it seems like that's the argument that students who love it need to make to their parents, right? Who are more skeptical, or their friends who are majoring in business.
I also, I'm sorry, but one more thing. There's a lot of gaslighting of the humanities' own argument on behalf of itself. In other words, I kind of disagree with you that we don't know how to tell the story. We don't know how to make the case. It has no uptake. It just gets ignored. It gets disqualified. Why are we still saying we need to make the case? Millions of people have made the case, and they make it over and over again. It's like, it's a form of not giving authority to a certain voice. It's like in cases where you got a seminar room full of, loud men and one woman, and the woman talks and nobody grants her any authority. The humanities is put in that position a little bit, I think, in the discursive.
Can I just want to respond to that a little bit, because I think Amanda, you're making I think a compelling case for what many people in English departments are doing well, right? But that, I think, is not. Let's take the example. Like, I want to bring out a little bit. There's very real problems, I think, with the discipline and with I don't think people are crazy when they look at the discipline and see a complete mess. And let me give you a couple examples of that. You talked about, I'm certainly not someone who says stay in your lane. I think to understand literature, we have to educate ourselves, but responsibly, in other fields. And I've published in neuroscience journals. I mean, and you've done a lot of that kind of interdisciplinary work in a responsible way. There's a very widely discussed study. The names of the authors escape me, but they looked at some of the most assigned books in the humanities, and one of them is a book called The New Jim Crow, which by Michelle Alexander, and these authors looked at, and it's assigned more than Hamlet. It's assigned in all kinds of disciplines, including English, they looked at it and they realized that this book is presented without any acknowledgement or any readings that look at the serious challenges to its argument from both the left and the right. And what the authors conclude, and what certainly and I'm sure you can relate to this as well, what they've concluded is a lot of the professors who are teaching this stuff just have no idea what they're talking about. And that is reality. The humanities, I'm sorry to say, has become a home for people who are talking about things that they don't know anything about. And that, I'm sorry to have to say that, but I think it's completely true. There's a lot of that happening. And you go into an English class and you're going to hear about war, about capitalism, about biology, about all these things. And when you drill down into it, there's not that actual sense of investigating what other people might think, what other disciplines know about this. So that makes a really difficult case. If you look at some websites, and I encourage folks to do this, of major English departments, and look at what they say on their websites when they try to describe what it is they're doing, in some cases they're quite good. In many cases it's just this mess. Like, what are we doing? One website I looked at says, we create knowledge about literature. And it's like, okay, what is knowledge about literature? Like, what about, like, we're going to, show you this awesome literature that is just great and everyone knows it's great, and teach you how to read it and how to approach it, and disclose to you the insights that can illuminate all different facets of human life. That I think is that's I think what we need to do. And the final point I'll make about that, about making the case, you're right. We don't need to make the case in that the public. I'm also a creative writer, and I go out and do all these events and hear from readers and so forth, non-academic audiences. The public knows that Shakespeare and Jane Austen are great. It's not a secret. You know what I'm talking about? It's not like people are like skeptical of the value of great literature. The skeptics are in many cases in the discipline of literature. And that is really, I think that that has really been my experience. I've been in English departments for 20 years. Wrote a book about this, and part of the thing was that the response I got from a lot of people loved the book and said it was great. A lot of people were like, we do not do that. We do not do great literature. We do analysis of social issues or economic issues and so forth. And so I do think, even as we're describing the kind of case we'd make, I think it's imperative to acknowledge the very real problems that the discipline has. And this, I think, is an issue. English professors and humanists in general, if you ask them what's wrong with their major, why the major has collapsed, they point the finger. They have a huge list, a laundry list of complaints outside. I do think there are some things that the discipline itself really needs to change. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that, but that's my sense.
I mean, I think that discipline should always be in the process of examining self-assessment, transformation. I mean, I think they are, and I think one thing that you raise is really interesting, the way certain texts, have this extraordinary uptake and come to stand in for, like whatever, anti-blackness in America in the case of the new Jim Crow. But, and I think that is I will cede that point, that there's sort of like, there's certain texts that you see on lots and lots of syllabi. But I do think that the field is more variegated than you see it. I think there's a lot of really exciting new subfields. Environmental humanities is one. Disability studies or health humanities is another. There are a lot of what we would call interdisciplines that are being really kind of generating a lot of interesting work in the humanities. And in the case of health humanities, AI and the humanities and the environmental humanities, they are, it's a case where, and I realize I'm saying the humanities instead of English, but forgive me. It's just, there's a real urgency about using what they call sort of integrative scholarship to approach and more fully understand and respond to these really serious challenges. And it's not just a case that like English or the humanities is, an assistant, like let me tell you about ethics, or, but that particularly in the case of AI, the question of the human is at the heart of the question of AI. And so there are these really interesting opportunities for growth in the discipline. And so I don't think it's only ever about the issues that you were highlighting.
I think we're in kind of a tough spot. The teacher of literature is in a tough spot because literature at its best is always trying to represent the whole of the human experience, right? And so if we're trying to teach literature and the writer's writing about politics, well, we've got to try to know at least enough about politics and help the students know enough about politics to engage the work, or human psychology, or whatever, whatever the work of literature is about. And it's about us. It's about being human. And so in a way, we're always going to be dilettantes with respect to the literature, because poets are irresponsible, right? In a way. Like, Plato was very clear on this. There's not a necessary relationship between writing in a really compelling way about some aspect of the world and actually knowing a lot about it, right? But literature's trying to stir us and to help enrich our understanding of what it is to be human. And so we've got to be dilettantes in a way. But I do think it's really important what you're saying about close reading, right? Because I think that's a very unifying part of our discipline. that maybe not everybody has the patience to do that anymore. Maybe not all English programs are doing that anymore. I don't know. But most of the colleagues I spend time with who have a very wide range of political, religious, social views, all value that. And we all know, if we care at all about teaching, we all know how powerful the experience of patient, careful, close reading can be for students and how transformative they feel like it is. So yeah, I mean, we're stuck, but at least we can identify some things where we are really, really good at this, right? This is something we have to offer, and we have a long tradition of it. We have professional expectations that we can hold each other to, even across different kinds of institutions. And we can offer this kind of experience that I think is a transformative experience and makes us better people. We can offer that to our students.
We have about 7 minutes until we move to the audience Q&A. I hope I have time to ask 2 more questions, but let me start with, I'll ask one first. Simon Doering of the University of Melbourne, he's the co-author of Amanda's forthcoming book, by the way, recently wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education that in response to the decline in the English major, quote, "There's a conservative turn happening in literary studies, although it hasn't received much public attention. Yet this conservative turn is significant. It marks a pivotal moment of recognition in the discipline of English's history." He goes on to say that this movement, as he describes it, entails, quote, "a return to disciplinary bedrock, an insistence that the methods and purposes that first define the discipline be respected and, in some form or other, resuscitated," unquote. And I would add that you guys have been talking about close reading. The scholar John Guillory, who's very interested in ways of kind of rejuvenated literary studies, his most recent book is on close reading. So that seems to be a part of what Doering is describing here. But is he right? Do you all detect this sort of conservative turn, not necessarily led by, MAGA professors or anything like that, but literary scholars who recognize this need to go back towards previous principles and approaches? And if so, would you characterize it in similar terms to what Doering is describing here, or do you see something else going on? Michael, let's start with you.
Simon used me as one of the examples of this this conservative turn. I'll just say about one of the interesting features of that, and a related topic of interest to many of us is the question of viewpoint diversity. And Simon was like, when he wrote the article, he was like, these folks like Clune and these other folks who are doing this, they're conservative in a pedagogical sense, but don't worry, they're very liberal and progressive in a political sense.
Yeah.
And I was like, how does he know that about me? You know what I mean? I was like, you don't know that. You know what I mean? And so that was my thing. I will say that I have detected, since I wrote my own book, I have detected a greater interest in the part of the professoriate in English to return to close reading and literary judgment in a way that was not true 10 years ago. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think part of it is really just the question of being able to make a compelling case and a clear case and a lucid case and a defensible case of what it is we do to the public, whether it's our students or whether it's university administrators or the public at large. I agree that close reading, and this is something Amanda was sort of implying earlier, it was always, I think it's always been the case that close reading and the teaching of great works, I don't think that went anywhere. I think it was always part of the profession, right? And I think some accounts of the profession have really distorted that reality. Like, we're not teaching Shakespeare. Every department's teaching Shakespeare, right? I just think that I think it's important to detach scholarship and publishing from pedagogy. And I think it's a really important question when we think about English, because we're not a natural science, and yet we've been put into the box of trying to emulate the natural sciences in terms of research, a word I hate as descriptive of humanistic scholarship and learning, right? I think it's just completely, it doesn't make any sense. And the reason I say that is because the research track over the past 3 or 4 decades has developed this, what economists call perverse incentives, where people are continually making arguments and advancing outlandish claims that are good for their career. Like, wow, this guy's saying that, great literature is actually just this BS thing that was invented to make the bourgeois seem, greater than the working class or whatever. Like, it's good for their careers, it's good for advancing, and it's fruitful for scholarship, but the big picture, it's destructive of the enterprise as a whole. So I think there's been a recognition of some of the costs of that movement pretty widely, and in many ways, it's really a revitalization of what people have been doing, at least a minority of professors have been doing for decades, but it's creating a vocabulary and a language to move that back to the center. So I think that's salutary.
Okay.
Well, I think what I see in what I experience of the profession is that there were some limited, people had the feeling anyway in the end of the 20th century that there are some really strong limited approaches that were required. Right? There's kind of a very limited and kind of orthodox set of approaches that to be a responsible scholar, you had to subscribe to one or another of these, and you get yourself in that camp, and then you have a clear path to help build a conversation about literature, and that path is going to depend on a lot of your fundamental commitments.
So you're talking about theories like post-colonialism or new historicism, things like that.
Yeah.
Right. And my sense is that those days are long gone. What I see is excitement about eclecticism, that scholars are open in a kind of a pragmatic way to trying to engage with literature in a way that's meaningful for them and that they think is going to be meaningful for other people, using whatever means come to hand and whatever means seem appropriate to the particular works they're looking at. As for conservatism, I don't know. I can't really speak to that. But what I can say is, in terms of scholarship, I do think people are more eclectic. There's less of a sense of kind of theoretical orthodoxy out there that you kind of have to submit to or die, and that there are a lot of good books coming out that do a lot of work that's not primarily concerned with theory. Everything has certain theories of reality that anybody starts writing, their writing is going to be driven by certain theories of reality that shape their thought. But there's a lot less concern to sort of be working on one particular strain of a theoretical project that is uniform and disciplined. And instead, people are just, I think there's a humanistic sense that, there's a lot to be excited about, and we want to try to find whatever means we can to understand the literature better and help other people enjoy it more.
I'll just say quickly, because I know, time is of the essence. But just that I think the field is quite pluralistic right now. I don't have the pessimistic view that generated this occasion's title. And didn't have that title when you invited me. A question mark would have been helpful. But anyway, so I don't have that view, and I think that there's a lot of really interesting work being generated. I think if you looked at the sort of job, there's very few jobs, but if you look, there's certain fields that it will indicate, some of this work in environmental humanities, for example. So I would just want to say that, and just quickly that, right, During is talking about a methodological conservatism, not conservatism.
Right.
Sorry, and I mean, I know you know that. I'm just alluding to the scene, and there's actually a subfield in English literature of manifestos about how the field should change, or is changing. And I would, in a way that falls into that. So there was this, post-critique, There's a lot of these sort of books, and then the citations to those books are numerous, but I'm not sure, I take your word for it, but I'm not sure that those manifestos necessarily change the field. They just become talked about a lot. And I think it's part of some people might be inspired by it, but it's I think it's part of the vitality of the field.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right, we have time for a few questions from attendees here. Michael in the back there.
Michael Casey, I'm with Law and Liberty, Liberty Fund's online journal. And last time Chris called on me, I asked 2 questions. So this time I promised to only ask 1. One of the things that makes me optimistic and hopeful about American universities and higher education right now is the emergence of these civic centers at campuses all over the country. Michael, I think you're teaching at one now. It seems like a real moment where some state legislators are deciding to reinvest in the social sciences and humanities. So my question is, how does English literature specifically and humane letters more broadly maybe feature into these civic centers specifically and civic education more broadly? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm at the Chase Center at Ohio State. I just moved there this year. And I'll say, absolutely. It is after spending 20 years in English departments, it's incredible to be at a place where they're hiring people. You know what I mean? Like there's investment, there's money, there's excitement. It's I've never really had that, you know what I mean, in English departments since I've been my whole professional life. The job market collapsed decades ago in English. So how does English literature fit into civic education? There's 2 answers to that question. One is you can think of the Civic Center movement in some ways as an alliance between 2 a sort of synergy between 2 different kinds of elements. One would be people who are very focused on the civic piece of it, and then there's people who are focused on what we might call great books, right? So a lot of the civic centers are creating. We're doing so at Chase, creating great books-like programs. They may not have the name great books. Some of them have humane letters or some other kind of title. But the idea is it's a course of study prioritizing close reading of great works of literature, right? That's one answer to the question. That's embedded in most of these centers, if not all of them. The other question is, it's my view and the view of many, I believe, that American literature, if we're just talking about the American experience, and these centers are often based on the ideals and culture of the Constitution of the United States, literature is a profound resource for understanding the animating ideals, as well as the tensions between those ideals, between, for example, freedom and equality, right? The experience of slavery, you know what I mean? Like all of these dimensions of the American experience and implications, American literature worked out in the 19th century very consciously with Walt Whitman and others, Frederick Douglass and others, what it means to have an American literature. And so that kind of, so I see it very much as as an integral part of an enterprise that also involves reading the founding documents and so forth, right? And it's an enterprise that brings in philosophers, political scientists, and literary scholars to give a really robust and I think multidimensional education for citizenship, if that answers your question.
More questions? Yeah, we're here.
My name is Jillian, and I am in no way an intellectual or an academic, and so this makes me really nervous to ask this question. However, I'll just say you've talked a lot. This has been fascinating. You've talked a lot about creating space, eliminating bias, evaluating holistically, and that maybe some of those demands are causing a dwindling interest in what you do. I'm from the K-12 world, and earlier this week, actually, an AEI senior fellow, Robert Pondisio, wrote an article about the 12th grade NAEP scores and actually gave some information and compared the abysmal scores to the Tylenol discussion, and said 12th graders, it's not that they can't read, it's that they can't read dense information. They distinguish types of evidence, compare conflicting results, evaluate credibility and motives, and synthesize across sources. And I was wondering if you could provide a little bit of nuance on, like, is that part of the dwindling as well? Is that our students can't read? Or is this a different subset of students? Or are we not creating the space that you're talking about in K-12 enough?
Any of you want to handle that? Daniel?
So I spend a lot of time thinking about education, in part because I helped to start a high school in the area. And one of our goals was to challenge students to read hard books and learn to love that activity. And I do think it could be really helpful for scholars of literature to take more interest in and try to help shape more the world of K through 12 education, and help teachers recognize what is possible. Because I think a lot of times it's hard to not lose hope, and help them have the resources to engage students in difficult work, invest our own time in trying to support them. So yeah, I mean, I say this all the time. Without good schools, my job is impossible. Because, right, how am I going to have students who have the capacity to love the things that I love and want to spend time with it?
Can I just ask if you're in public or private education?
I'm policymaker,
Oh, you're a policymaker. Okay.
former state superintendent.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I mean, I just sort of, first of all, thank you for the work you do. And I'm very mindful of the fact that, right, that I mean, the way in which the, upcoming generation has been, well, just the cultural conditions that they've been in, i.e., media, and yeah, this sort of like the creeping AI, that this is coming for us, whatever we think, and even whatever kind of places we teach. And so I do think it's really, really crucial.
I have to say, I was heartened by what you all said about your students. I talked to other English professors who have kind of recognized a dwindling of the abilities. So it's good to hear from professors who've had other experiences, especially since it seems like, the College Board, the SATs, their long reading section used to require students to read something like 800 words, and now it's basically 150 words max, which is basically a tweet. And so they expect less of students, and that's certainly not helping things.
Yeah.
With the people in charge of the testing having such low expectations there. Gentleman in the back there.
Hi, John. In defense of students, do you think there's a corresponding diminishment in abilities of the professors, apart and separate from over-intellectualizing and systematizing? For instance, I'm just going to guess that 50 years ago, or a literature professor, on the whole, knew more languages than a literature professor today. He may have been more erudite, read more books than your peers today. And so might there be some sort of reinforcing mutual diminishment in ability between student and professor?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's for sure. I mean, it's just the case that having gone to a grad school where there were people like Alan Grossman and Michael Fried, these are eminent older scholars that I had the opportunity to work with. They had a breadth of it. They were raised under a different educational system, and they had a breadth of knowledge and a depth of knowledge that has become very rare. And I think, and it's some of the problems with the discipline that I was describing. I think the sense of what it is we do right? And what an English professor, that the confusion, in my view, about that has combined with other factors to produce what I think many of, I talk about this with my friends all the time. We're not producing scholars that have that kind of depth, and you're getting a much shallower experience in the classroom because of that. I think that's for me, in my experience, I'll just say I think that's unquestionably true. I'll say something that hasn't been really addressed except sort of implied, but is absolutely crucial to this discussion, which is the collapse of the English job market in professorships in English over the past decades, right? It's been going on for a very long time, has had all kinds of implications that are detrimental, and I don't think the field has really grappled with. One of those is the fact that it's hard to attract the best students to go to grad school when there's no jobs. You know what I'm saying? So there's that. I think that's a real question. The other thing I'll say is that the kind of research that English professors produce is for a dwindling market of people, because the graduate students who used to be 30 years ago the main consumers of that audience has largely dried up, and or gotten a lot smaller, as have new professors. And the biggest index of that, I'll say this, is Yale had me out to give a talk in their comp lit department a few years ago, and they said, while you're here, we want you to talk to our faculty about publishing in non-academic venues. And that talk I gave was much more widely attended than my scholarly talk. And what's happened, and I've seen this, and I wonder if Amanda's had this similar experience, the actual value of academic disciplinary work has declined, and the value of public-facing work, of which I do both, but has really ascended. And to me, that's a very dangerous symptom of a loss of faith within the professoriate of the value of disciplinary scholarship. And so I think English is in a rough place, right? I think that reform and re-envisioning what it is going to really involve much larger scale interventions, is just my 2 cents to that great question.
But it's not just English, I think, right? I mean, everybody's coming out of the same educational system. And it's not like engineering professors are more erudite than they were 50 years ago. So yeah, I mean, we get the professors we deserve out of the culture we create.
I mean, what does erudite mean? I reject this distinction. I don't think that professors who work now are, know less or have less depth. It's just that the conditions of the world have changed. And if you can't let go of the past, and if you just want everyone to be like, somebody who intimidated you when you were 22, then that's ridiculous. I'm sorry, I just don't agree with this at all. The one place where I think it is a problem, and where what's happening with professors is the same as what's happening with students, is in the attention problem, is in the screen addiction. So I think that professors, they'll admit it, at a dinner party after a glass of wine. I'll say, do you have trouble reading? And they're like, oh, well, yeah. I mean, just in a sustained way. But that has nothing to do with like being, less intelligent, less deep, knowing less. They're just know different things. Or reading less, they just know different things. So erudite. Give me a break. Okay.
Thank you all very much. We're out of, wait, we had at 6:30, right? Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Amanda, Daniel, and Michael, that was a lot of fun. Appreciate your time.
That was very fun, yeah.
Great, thanks. Great questions.